Sable hadn't expected the end of her quiet life to walk through the front door on a Tuesday evening. But there he stood in the entrance of the stone hearth, filling the doorway with shoulders that hadn't been that broad when she'd known him, flanked by two guards in dark leather who scanned the room like it might contain a threat worthy of their attention. It did not. The Stone Hearth was a 12-table restaurant in a harbor town that smelled of roasted garlic and beeswax candles, and the kind of warmth that made strangers linger too long over their wine. The most dangerous thing in it was Odessa's opinions on overcooked fish. But the man in the doorway was dangerous. Sable knew that, not because of the guards or the sword at his hip, or the way every single person in the dining room had gone absolutely silent at the sight of him. She knew because she had loved him once, badly and completely, and he had left her without a single word. Theron Valcrest. First son of a minor borderland pack that no longer existed because he had conquered and absorbed every territory between the Northern Ridge and the Ashenmere coast, commander of the Blackthorn War, victor of the Siege of Harrowfield, Alpha King of the entire realm, and the boy who used to steal bread rolls from her kitchen window when he thought she wasn't looking. Sable stood frozen between two tables, with a cast-iron skillet of braised lamb in one hand and a basket of rosemary flatbread in the other. Her arms had stopped working. Her legs had stopped working. Her brain had stopped working entirely, because it was too busy screaming at her that this was not possible, that this was some kind of fever-induced hallucination, brought on by standing over a hot stove for 9 hours. But the hallucination turned its head and looked directly at her. Dark eyes found hers across the crowded room, and the recognition was instantaneous. She watched it hit him, watched his entire body go rigid, watched the controlled mask of the Alpha King crack open for a single unguarded second to reveal something raw and stunned beneath it. His lips parted. His hand, which had been resting on the back of a chair, clenched until the wood groaned beneath his grip. The room was watching. Sable could feel every pair of eyes in the restaurant bouncing between her and the king like spectators at a blood match. Old Dennick, at table 4, had his spoon suspended halfway to his mouth, broth dripping silently back into the bowl. The merchant couple by the window had stopped arguing about their wine and were staring openly. A serving girl stood motionless near the bar, a pitcher of water clutched to her chest like a shield. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth fire and the faint, distant cry of gulls from the harbor. She needed to move. She needed to put down the skillet and the bread and walk calmly back to the kitchen and possibly never come out again. Instead, she stood there and stared at him, while a lifetime of buried feelings detonated in her chest like a string of charges, one after another after another. He was taller than she remembered, leaner in the face, harder in the jaw, with the kind of stillness that came from years of being the most lethal person in any room he entered. There was a scar along his left temple that hadn't been there before, a thin white line that disappeared into his hairline. The boyishness was gone entirely, replaced by something carved and commanding and almost frighteningly controlled. But his eyes were the same. Dark and steady and devastatingly familiar, and when they locked onto hers, Sable felt 17 again, standing in the kitchen garden at sundown with time in her hair, being kissed for the first time by a boy who tasted like stolen bread. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, not the lazy, contented stretch of everyday awareness, something sharper, something that pulled toward him like iron toward a lodestone, straining against her ribs with an urgency that terrified her. Something clattered. Sable looked down and realized she'd tilted the skillet. Braised lamb and caramelized onions were sliding slowly toward the edge in a glossy, herb-flecked avalanche. She righted it with a lurch, sloshing sauce onto her wrist, and the pain snapped her out of whatever trance had seized her. "Move," she told herself. "For the love of all things holy, move." She moved. She set the skillet down on the nearest table, which was not the table it belonged to, mumbled something incoherent to the startled couple seated there, and turned toward the kitchen with the kind of rigid, mechanical walk usually reserved for people trying to outpace an explosion. She made it 4 steps before the voice reached her. Sable, her name in his mouth, low and rough, and stripped of every title and pleasantry. Just her name, spoken like it had been sitting on his tongue for years, waiting to be released. The sound of it went through her like a blade, sharp and clean and unbearably precise, hitting something she'd thought was dead and buried, and finding it very much alive. She did not turn around. She kept walking, pushed through the kitchen door, and pressed her back against the wall beside the spice rack, while her heart tried to beat its way out through her ribs. Odessa looked up from the stockpot. The old woman's silver-threaded hair was pinned up in its usual chaotic bun, and her sharp green eyes missed nothing. They moved over Sable's flushed face and trembling hands and sauce-stained wrist and arrived at a conclusion before Sable could speak. "You look like you've seen a dead man walking," Odessa said. "Worse," Sable managed, her voice coming out thin and strange. "I've seen a living one." Before Odessa could respond, the kitchen door opened. A guard stood in the frame, his face carefully blank, and behind him, she could see Merrick, the king's beta, a tall man with a close-cropped beard, and calm, assessing eyes that reminded Sable of a hawk deciding whether something was prey. "The Alpha King has requested the chef," Merrick said. "By name. 9 years." That's how long it had been since Sable had last seen Theron Valcrest, and not one of those years had been kind enough to blur the memory. She'd been 16 when he arrived in Brindlemoor, a coastal town so small it barely warranted a dot on any map. His father's pack had been displaced by a border skirmish, and 3 dozen wolves had washed up on the harbor with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a grim, hollow-eyed exhaustion that Sable recognized because she'd worn it herself once. Odessa had taken them in. That was what Odessa did. She fed people. She'd fed Sable when she was a feral, half-starved orphan of 7, had dragged her out of the gutter behind the fishmonger's stall, and put a wooden spoon in her hand and told her that anyone who could survive alone on the streets for 2 years could certainly learn to make a decent soup. Sable had. She learned soup, and bread, and braised meats and delicate pastries and every single thing Odessa could teach her, because cooking was the first thing in her life that made her feel like she had a right to exist. When Theron's pack arrived, Sable had been the one hauling pots of stew down to the harbor. He'd been sitting apart from the others, a lean, sharp-featured boy of 17, with dark eyes that watched everything and gave away nothing. She'd handed him a bowl. He'd looked at the stew, then at her, and said, "This smells better than anything I've eaten in 3 months." "It's just mutton stew," she'd replied. "It's not," he'd said, and something in the way he looked at her made the back of her neck go warm. That was the beginning. He stayed in Brindlemoor for 2 years. He helped in the kitchens. He carried flour sacks and chopped firewood and peeled enough potatoes to feed a small army. He ate everything she cooked with a concentration and gratitude that made her feel seen in a way she had never been seen before. And somewhere between the flour-dusted mornings and the long walks along the harbor wall at dusk, Sable fell in love with him so thoroughly that it rewrote the architecture of her heart. She was 18, and he was 19, when he kissed her for the first time, in the kitchen garden behind the stone hearth, with thyme in her hair and flour on her cheek. She remembered the exact way his hand had trembled against her jaw, the way he'd whispered her name, like a confession, and she remembered the morning she woke up and he was gone. No letter, no explanation, just a cold bed and a rumor that the Valcrest boy had left before dawn, headed north to join the Border Legion. She'd waited for a message, a word, anything. Weeks became months. Months became a year. The year became 2, then 5, then 7. She stopped waiting. She did not stop hurting. She heard his name in fragments over the years, as everyone did. Theron Valcrest had risen through the military ranks like wildfire. He'd won the Blackthorn War at 2030-17. He'd claimed the throne at 25 after the old king died without an heir, and the Council of Alphas had chosen Theron because no one else was strong enough, or terrifying enough, to hold the fractured realm together. He was the Alpha King now, the most powerful wolf alive, and the entire continent spoke his name with a mixture of reverence and fear. Sable did not speak his name at all. She packed it into a box inside her chest and buried it deep and built a life on top of it. And if the box rattled sometimes in the quiet hours of early morning, she pretended not to hear it. Now the box had blown wide open, and its contents were sitting in her dining room requesting the chef by name. Sable looked at Merrick, then at Odessa, then back at Merrick. "I can't," she said. Merrick's expression did not change. The king's request was not a suggestion. "Then tell him the chef is indisposed." "Are you indisposed?" Merrick asked. "I am extremely indisposed," Sable said, wiping her sauce-stained hands on her apron with jerky, agitated movements. "I am the most indisposed person in this building." Odessa cleared her throat. "Sable, no. He's the Alpha King." "I know who he is, Odessa." The old woman gave her a long, measured look. "Then you also know that refusing his request in a room full of witnesses will raise questions. Neither of you wants answered." Sable opened her mouth, closed it, and felt the fight drain out of her because Odessa was right. She was always right. It was infuriating. She pulled off her apron, smoothed her hair with hands that would not stop trembling, and followed Merrick through the kitchen door. The dining room had not recovered. Conversations had resumed in low, careful murmurs, but the energy was charged and watchful. Two of the king's guards stood against the far wall. He rose when she approached. The gesture was automatic, the ingrained manners of a boy who'd been taught to stand when someone entered a room, and it caught her so off guard that she almost tripped on the edge of a floorboard. "Sable," he said again. Quieter this time, almost uncertain, and the sound of her name in that voice sent a crack running through the wall she'd spent a decade building. "Your Majesty," she replied, and watched the title land like a slap. Something flickered in his expression. He gestured to the seat across from him. "I didn't come here to pull rank on you," he said. "Then why did you come?" The question was out before she could stop it, sharper than she intended, carrying a decade of unanswered silence in its edge. Theron was quiet for a moment. "I heard the food was exceptional." The audacity of that sentence, the sheer absurdity of the Alpha King walking into her 12-table restaurant after all those years of nothing, and claiming he was here for the braised lamb, made Sable want to throw something. But Merrick was watching from across the room, and Odessa was watching from the kitchen doorway, and 24 strangers were watching from their tables. So Sable sat. "What would you like to eat?" she asked, her voice flat. Theron's gaze dropped to the table, then back to her. Something passed across his face that she couldn't read, something almost pained. "Whatever you recommend," he said. She went back to the kitchen, cooked his meal with hands that shook the entire time, and brought it out herself, because she refused to let anyone else see whatever was about to happen. She set the plate in front of him. Roasted duck breast with blackberry glaze, charred root vegetables, and a side of crushed herb potatoes with a drizzle of smoked garlic oil. Theron stared at the plate. He did not pick up his fork. His jaw was tight, and there was something in his expression that Sable had never seen before, not in the boys she'd known, not in any of the portraits and illustrations that had circulated of the king. He looked afraid. The Alpha King looked afraid of a plate of food. Sable frowned. "Is something wrong with it?" "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. She watched him pick up his fork, watched his hand hesitate over the plate, watched him cut a small piece of duck with the deliberate care of a man performing surgery. He raised it to his mouth. He chewed and stopped. His eyes closed, his hand lowered to the table. The fork slipped from his fingers and clinked against the plate, and his entire body went still in a way that made Sable's breath catch, because she had never seen someone react to food like this. Like it was the first meal they'd had in years. When his eyes opened, they were bright, too bright, and he blinked rapidly and turned his face slightly away from her. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough and uneven. "Theron," Sable said, and the name came out without permission, shedding years of silence like it had never been gone. "What's wrong?" He shook his head, unable to speak, and pressed his fingers hard against his eyes. The Alpha King, the most powerful man on the continent, was sitting in her restaurant trying not to cry over a piece of roasted duck. Sable looked across the room and found Merrick standing against the wall. The beta was staring at the king with an expression that Sable could only describe as stunned. Not the casual surprise of someone witnessing something unexpected, but the raw, desperate shock of someone watching the impossible happen. Their eyes met, hers and Merrick's, and the beta moved toward her. "I need to speak with you," Merrick said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Privately? Tonight, after the king has gone." "About what?" Sable demanded. Merrick glanced at Theron, who was eating now, slowly and carefully, like a man afraid the food would vanish if he moved too fast. Each bite landed with visible, devastating impact. His eyes kept closing, his hand kept pausing. He was savoring it like a man who'd forgotten what savoring felt like. Merrick looked back at Sable, and what she saw in the beta's face sent a chill sliding down her spine. "The king is dying," Merrick said. "And you're the first person in 14 months who has been able to make him eat." The stone hearth was empty now, the chairs upturned on the tables, the candles guttering in their holders. Odessa was scrubbing the large stock pot with a silence that meant she was listening very hard and choosing very carefully not to interrupt. Theron had eaten everything. Every bite of duck, every roasted vegetable, every scrap of herb-crushed potato, and the honey-drizzled pear tart she'd added without being asked. He'd eaten for almost an hour, with the focused intensity of a starving man who couldn't quite believe the food was real. Then he'd left with his guards flanking him like shadows. He hadn't spoken another word to her. He hadn't needed to. Now Merrick sat at the scrubbed oak table in the center of the kitchen, waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. "Start from the beginning," Sable said. Merrick studied her for a moment, measuring something. "What do you know about the Greycairn Rebellion?" "Only what everyone knows," Sable said. A rogue coalition of packs in the Western Highlands refused to recognize the crown. There was a siege. The king ended it. "He ended it," Merrick repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "He also ended the lives of 300 wolves who refused to surrender." The siege had reached a breaking point, and a civilian settlement was caught in the crossfire. Sable's stomach tightened. Among the dead was a woman named Vyra, a healer. She'd been trying to evacuate the wounded when the outer wall collapsed. The king pulled her from the rubble himself, but she died in his arms. The kitchen was very quiet. Odessa had stopped scrubbing. Vyra's mother was a woman of old power, Merrick continued. A practitioner of the kind of magic that most people believe died out centuries ago. When she found her daughter's body, she cursed the king. Cursed him. How? Sable asked, though something cold was already pooling in her stomach. The exact words were, "You fed my daughter to the stones. Now nothing will feed you. Every meal will turn to ash on your tongue. Every swallow will be sand in your throat, and you will starve the way she starved for air beneath the weight of your war." Merrick recited the words with the flat precision of someone who had memorized them. Sable felt the blood drain from her face. "It took hold within a week," Merrick said. "At first, the food simply lost its flavor. Then it began to taste wrong. Bitter, then metallic, then like ash, exactly as she promised. Within a month, the king couldn't keep anything down. His body rejected every meal, every potion, every remedy, every healer's attempt to break the curse has failed." "For 14 months?" Sable whispered. 14 months, Merrick confirmed. "His alpha metabolism has kept him alive but barely. He's burning through his own body to sustain himself. Muscle mass, bone density, healing capacity, it's all deteriorating. The court physicians give him another 4 to 6 months before his body can no longer compensate." The words settled over Sable like stones, dropped one by one into deep water. "He's been hiding this," she said. It wasn't a question. "As best he can," Merrick said. "A handful of people know myself, his physician, 2 members of the inner council. If word reached the border packs that the Alpha King was weakening, the challenges would begin within a fortnight. He'd be dead inside a month." Sable pressed her palms flat against the table to keep them from shaking. And tonight, the food I made, he could actually eat it. He tasted it, Merrick said, and his voice shifted, lost some of its controlled calm, and let something desperate bleed through. Do you understand what I'm telling you? In 14 months, every piece of food that has touched his lips has turned to ash, every single one. Tonight, he ate an entire meal. He tasted every bite. He kept it down. His body didn't reject it. Sable stared at him. I watched his face, Merrick continued. I've watched him try to eat hundreds of times, watched him choke on ash and slam his fist against the table. Tonight was different. Tonight, he ate your food, and the curse didn't touch it. The silence that followed was deafening. Odessa spoke from the sink, her voice quiet and steady. Why, her food and no one else's? We don't know, Merrick admitted. That's what we need to find out. Sable's mind was racing, circling back to the image of Theron's face when he'd taken that first bite, the way his eyes had closed, the way his hand had trembled. She thought about the boy who'd sat on the harbor wall eating her mutton stew and telling her it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. She thought about the morning she'd woken up alone. Why did he come here? Sable asked. To Brindlemore. To this restaurant. Merrick hesitated, and for the first time his composure faltered. The king's traveling route was meant to pass north of here. He diverted. He told me he wanted to see the coast. Another pause. He didn't tell me you were here. I don't think he planned to come inside. I think he saw the restaurant and couldn't stop himself. Something twisted deep behind her ribs. I need you to cook for him again, Merrick said. Tomorrow. A full meal. Prepared the same way, the same kitchen, the same hands. I need to know if tonight was an anomaly, or if it's something about you specifically. And if it is me, Sable asked. Merrick met her eyes. Then, I am going to ask you to leave this restaurant and come to the capital. I'm going to ask you to cook for the king every single day until we either break this curse or find another solution. Sable opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I know what I'm asking, Merrick said. I know your history with him. I know he left this town 9 years ago, and I know the manner in which he left. He's told me. Her throat tightened. He told you? Enough, Merrick said quietly. Sable looked away. Her hands were trembling against the table. 9 years she'd spent rebuilding her life around the crater Theron Valcrest had left in it. 9 years of teaching herself that she was enough, without him. And now the universe was asking her to walk straight back into the blast radius. Let me think about it, she said. Merrick nodded and stood. He'll be at the inn on the North Road. I'll send word in the morning. He left, and Sable sat in the silence and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Odessa dried her hands on a towel and sat down across from her. She didn't speak. She just sat there, the way she'd sat with Sable 1,000 times before, through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks and the long, quiet grief of learning to live without the person you loved most. Don't say it, Sable muttered. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say that I've already decided. Odessa raised one eyebrow. Have you? Sable pressed her forehead against the table and groaned. Of course she had. She'd decided the moment Merrick said the word dying. She'd decided before that, if she was honest, the moment she'd watched Theron close his eyes over a bite of roasted duck, like it was a prayer being answered. She hated him for leaving. She hated him for coming back. And she was going to save his miserable life whether he deserved it or not. The next morning, Merrick arrived at the stone hearth before dawn. Sable was already in the kitchen because she hadn't slept, and because when she couldn't sleep, she cooked. She prepared 3 dishes: a slow-poached egg with seared greens and a warm vinaigrette, a bowl of bone broth simmered overnight with marrow and fennel, and a small loaf of sourdough bread, the same recipe Odessa had taught her when she was 9. Take me to him, Sable said. The inn was modest, the kind of place that catered to merchants and minor nobles passing through. Theron was standing by the window when they entered. He turned, and his gaze went to Sable's face first, then to the covered tray in her hands. And something naked and vulnerable flashed across his expression before he could lock it down. He looked worse in daylight. The hollows beneath his cheekbones were deeper than she'd noticed the night before. His shirt hung looser than it should have on a frame built for considerably more mass. "Sit down," Sable said, and the command came out firmer than she intended. Theron blinked at her. He sat. She uncovered the dishes. He picked up the bread first, tore off a small piece, raised it to his mouth, chewed, his eyes closed. His shoulders dropped. He swallowed, and nothing happened. No gagging, no rejection, no ash. He ate everything, every bite, slowly and carefully, pausing between courses as though afraid his body might change its mind. When the last of the bread was gone, Theron pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. His shoulders were shaking. Sable stood in the corner and watched the Alpha King weep silently over an empty breakfast tray, and felt the ground beneath her certainty give way. The anger she'd carried for so long, the armor she'd built from it, none of it could survive this. Not the sight of him breaking over a piece of bread she'd baked. Merrick caught her in the corridor afterward. "It's you," he said. "It's not the kitchen, it's not the ingredients. It's you." Sable already knew what was coming. "We leave for the capital in 2 days," Merrick said. "The king needs you at Ashenmere. Does he know you're asking me?" Merrick's silence was answer enough. "He doesn't want me there," Sable said. "He doesn't want to need you there," Merrick corrected. "There's a difference." Sable stared down the corridor toward the closed door of the king's room. Behind it, a man she'd loved and lost was slowly starving to death. And she was the only person alive who could stop it. She thought about her restaurant, about Odessa, about the life she'd built, brick by brick, from nothing. And she thought about the look on Theron's face when he tasted bread for the first time in 14 months. 2 days, she said. "I'll need that long to make arrangements." Merrick nodded. "There's one more thing. He can't know. I told you about the curse. As far as the king is concerned, you've been invited as a guest chef for the royal household. If he discovers I've revealed his condition to a civilian, he'll remove me from my post." Sable stared at him. "You want me to move into the palace, cook for a man who abandoned me 9 years ago, save his life in secret, and pretend I don't know he's dying." Merrick considered this. "When you put it like that, it does sound unreasonable. It sounds insane. Will you do it?" Sable ground her teeth together so hard her jaw ached. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." The capital was nothing like Brindle-Moor. Ashenmere sprawled across a river valley in a vast noisy tangle of stone and timber and ambition. The streets teemed with merchants, soldiers, nobles in embroidered cloaks, and wolves in human skin who moved through the crowds with the coiled, restless energy of predators navigating territory that didn't quite belong to them. The palace sat at the city's heart, a fortress of dark granite and iron that rose above the rooftops like a clenched fist. Sable hated it on sight. She missed the salt air. She missed the cry of gulls, and the rhythm of the tides and the way the morning fog rolled in off the water and wrapped around the stone hearth like a blanket. She missed Odessa, who had kissed her forehead and pressed a bundle of dried herbs into her hands and whispered, "Feed the idiot king and come home." Instead, she was standing in the largest kitchen she had ever seen, staring at a row of copper pots that probably cost more than her entire restaurant. "These are your quarters," Merrick said, gesturing to a small but comfortable room adjoining the kitchen. A bed, a writing desk, a window overlooking a courtyard where 2 guards were sparring with wooden swords. "You'll have full access to the kitchen stores, the herb garden, and the cold cellars. The king takes his meals in his private study. You'll bring them yourself." "Myself?" Sable frowned. "Don't you have a staff of 40 people for this?" "The king has a staff of 40 people who have been unable to feed him for over a year," Merrick said evenly. "You are not staff. You are a guest of the crown. If anyone asks, you are here to consult on the royal kitchen's menu for the coming harvest festival." "A cover story," Sable said flatly. "A necessary one." Sable looked around the gleaming, cavernous kitchen with its hanging copper and marble countertops and felt profoundly out of place. She was a harbor town cook who made stews and bread and honest meals for fishermen and dock workers. She did not belong in a palace kitchen that could comfortably house her entire restaurant inside it twice over. but she was here, and somewhere above her in the upper floors of this granite fortress, Theron was starving. So, she unpacked her knives, tied on her apron, and got to work. The first meal she brought him was lunch, a simple thing by her standards. Pan-seared river trout, with a lemon and caper butter, roasted carrots tossed in honey and thyme, and fresh bread from the oven, with a crock of salted butter. She climbed the stairs to his study, carrying the tray, her heart beating far too fast for someone delivering a meal. A guard opened the door. Sable stepped inside. The study was enormous, lined with maps and books, and the organized clutter of a man who ran a kingdom from behind a desk. Theron sat at a massive oak table covered in correspondence, his dark head bent over a letter, a pen in his hand. He didn't look up when she entered. Sable set the tray on the side table. The clink of the plate against wood made him glance over, and when he saw her, he went very still. "I didn't realize you'd arrived," he said. "This morning," Sable replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Merrick showed me the kitchen." An awkward silence stretched between them. He looked at the tray, then back at her, and she saw the same flash of fear she'd witnessed at the inn. The fear that the food wouldn't work, that last night and this morning had been flukes, that this reprieve was temporary. "Eat," Sable said, "before it gets cold." He pulled the tray toward him, cut into the trout with careful movements, raised the fork to his mouth. His whole body stilled. His chest expanded with a long, slow breath. He chewed, swallowed, and when he looked at her, the relief in his expression was so raw, it was almost indecent. "Good?" Sable asked, though the answer was written across his face. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. He cleared his throat. "Yes, it's good." She watched him eat, with the careful attention of someone monitoring a patient, though she was supposed to be pretending she didn't know he was sick. Every bite he took, she tracked. Every reaction, she catalogued. The way his shoulders gradually loosened, the way color began to creep back into his complexion, faint but visible, like watching a candle catch after a long struggle with the wick. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time since she'd walked into the room. "Why did you agree to come here?" he asked. Sable had prepared for this question. She'd rehearsed several answers on the long carriage ride, from Brindlemoor, cool, professional answers, answers that kept years of heartbreak neatly contained behind a wall of polite distance. What came out instead was, "Because Merrick asked me to, and unlike some people, when someone needs my help, I show up." The words landed with more force than she intended. She watched them hit him, watched the flinch he tried to suppress and didn't quite manage. "Sable," he started. "Don't," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. "Whatever you're about to say about the past, don't. I'm here to cook, that's all." His jaw tightened. He nodded once, short and sharp, and turned back to his correspondence. Sable picked up the empty tray and left. She made it to the bottom of the staircase before her composure cracked, and she pressed the tray against her chest and breathed through the tight, burning knot in her throat until the urge to cry passed. A routine formed over the following days. Sable cooked 3 meals a day and watched him eat with the quiet focus of someone tending a flame. Each meal worked. The curse couldn't touch her food. Theron ate everything she prepared. He was gaining weight slowly, the hollows in his cheeks beginning to fill, his movements growing more fluid as strength returned to a body that had been consuming itself for over a year. He didn't talk much during meals, neither did she. Their conversations were limited to the practical. "Will you be eating in the study or the drawing room tonight?" "The study." "Do you have any food you can't tolerate?" "Shellfish." "Do you want dessert?" "I want whatever you think I should eat." That last one had caught her off guard. The trust in it, the quiet surrender of control. The Alpha King, who commanded armies and ruled kingdoms, deferring to a harbor town cook about what should go into his body, but the silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. It filled with all the things they weren't saying. Why he left, why he never wrote, why he diverted his route to pass through Brindlemoor after all that time and stood outside her restaurant before walking in. On the 5th evening, Sable brought his dinner later than usual. She'd been experimenting with a new recipe, a slow braised venison with juniper berries and roasted root vegetables. And it had taken longer than she'd planned. She knocked on his study door, and when no answer came, she pushed it open. The room was dim, lit only by the dying fire. Theron was sitting at his desk, but he wasn't working. His head was resting on his folded arms, and his breathing was slow and heavy and uneven. Sable set the tray down quietly and moved closer. In the low firelight, she could see his face, the tight, pained furrow between his brows, the way his lips were pressed together, the sheen of sweat across his forehead. He was having a nightmare, she realized. He'd fallen asleep at his desk, and something was tormenting him. She reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, his hand shot up and seized her wrist. His grip was crushing, his eyes snapping open, wild and unfocused and glowing amber, the wolf surging to the surface. He lunged upright, and before Sable could react, she was pressed against the wall with his forearm across her collarbone and his face inches from hers. The amber faded. Recognition flooded in. Horror replaced the feral intensity in his eyes, and he released her so fast he stumbled backward into the desk. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice ragged and raw. "I didn't know it was you. I thought you were." He stopped. His chest was heaving, and his hands were shaking at his sides, and in the flickering firelight, Sable could see what the curse was really doing to him, not just starving his body. Something else was happening, something deeper and darker, something she hadn't been told about. "What were you dreaming about?" Sable asked, quietly, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had left red marks. Theron's gaze dropped to her wrist. The color drained from his face. "Did I hurt you?" he whispered. "Answer my question," she said. His jaw clenched. He turned away, bracing his hands against the desk, his head dropping between his shoulders. "Theron," Sable said, stepping forward. "What's happening to you? And don't lie to me, because I already know about the curse." He went rigid. Slowly, he turned to face her. "Who told you?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that there's more to this than food, isn't there? Something else is wrong. Something you're hiding from Merrick, from your physicians, from everyone." The fire cracked. Shadows shifted across his face. "Yes," he said finally. "There's more." Sable waited. Theron looked at her with eyes that held something she had never seen in them before. Not since they were young, not even then. "The curse doesn't just take my food," he said. "It takes me somewhere. Every time I close my eyes." After his confession, Sable expected the king to retreat behind his walls. Most men did once they'd said too much. But Theron didn't retreat. He went quiet, which was different, and the silence that settled between them for the next few days had a bruised quality to it. Tender and careful and full of things. Neither of them was ready to say. She cooked. He ate. That was their language now, and it said more than words could have. On the third morning after his confession, Sable brought him a breakfast of soft scrambled eggs, folded with fresh herbs, thick slices of toasted sourdough, and a pot of tea brewed with dried chamomile and lemon peel. She set it on his desk without ceremony, and he reached for the bread before she'd even stepped back. "You always start with the bread," she said. Theron paused, the slice halfway to his mouth. "Do I?" "Every meal. Bread first, then whatever else is on the plate, then bread again at the end. You've done it since you were 17. He looked at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," Sable said, and immediately wished she hadn't, because the words came out too honest, too exposed, and the way his expression changed made her chest hurt. He looked back down at the bread. "This is the same recipe," he said quietly. "The one Odessa taught you." "You remember that?" Sable echoed, and the faintest ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I remember everything, too." The silence that followed was warm and terrible, and Sable left before it could become something more, but their conversations grew longer after that, not by much, not the sprawling, effortless talks of their youth. These were careful things, measured in sentences rather than hours, but each one peeled back another layer. He told her about the Blackthorn War, Not the version in the history books, but the real one. The freezing nights, the sound of wolves dying in the snow, the weight of sending men into battles that not all of them would walk away from. He told her without self-pity, in the flat, matter-of-fact voice of someone who had made peace with the facts, if not the feelings. She told him about building the stone hearth. The year the roof leaked so badly, she'd cooked through an entire winter with a pot under every rafter. The time a merchant tried to swindle Odessa out of the building's lease, and Odessa had chased him down the harbor road with a cast-iron pan. The way cooking had saved her, had given her something to pour herself into when everything else felt empty. She did not say when you left, she didn't need to. They both heard it. He started asking for specific things. Not demands, never demands, but quiet requests that carried the weight of memory. The potato soup from the harbor, he said one evening, and Sable knew exactly which one he meant. The recipe she'd made on cold nights when the wind came off the water and the kitchen fogged up from the steam. She made it the same way with heavy cream and roasted garlic and fresh chives. And when he tasted it, she watched 10 years fall away from his face in the space of a single breath. I dreamed about this soup, he said, so quietly she almost missed it. During the war, on the worst nights, I'd close my eyes and try to remember exactly how it tasted. Sable had to leave the room after that. She stood in the corridor and pressed her knuckle against her teeth and told herself she was not going to cry over a man and a bowl of soup. One evening, close to a fortnight after she'd arrived, Theron asked her to stay while he finished his evening reports. I work better after I've eaten, he said, and the excuse was so transparent that Sable almost smiled. She sat in the chair by the fire and mended a tear in her apron while he wrote. The scratch of his pen against parchment was steady and rhythmic, and the fire crackled low, and the room smelled of the rosemary lamb she'd made for dinner, and for one dangerous, perfect moment, it felt like home. Why did you leave? Sable asked. The pen stopped. She hadn't planned to say it. The question had been living in her throat since the day he left, and it climbed out on its own. Quiet and simple and devastating. Theron set the pen down. He didn't look at her. My father was dying, he said. A blood debt had been called in by the northern Pax. If I didn't go, they would have come for the entire family and for everyone associated with us. He paused. Including you. Sable's hands went still on the apron. I couldn't tell you, he continued, his voice low and rough. If you'd known, you would have tried to come with me. And where I was going, you wouldn't have survived. You don't get to decide that for me, Sable said, and her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I know, he replied. I know that now. The fire popped. Embers scattered across the hearth. During the first year, I never sent them. Why not? Because every time I picked up a pen, I knew that if I gave you a thread to follow, you'd pull on it until you found me, and the place I was in would have killed you. His jaw tightened. So, I let you think I'd forgotten. It was the cruelest thing I've ever done, and I've done cruel things, Sable. But that one sits heaviest. Sable stared at the fire and felt the wall she'd built begin to crumble. Not all at once, but in slow, grinding increments, like a dam giving way. 11 letters, she repeated. I still have them, he said. She looked at him then, and the rawness in his face made her breath catch. This was not the Alpha King. This was the boy from the harbor wall, the one who looked at her stew like it was a miracle, and at her like she was the reason miracles existed. Show me, she said. He rose, crossed to a cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a small brass key, and withdrew a bundle of folded papers tied with a leather cord. The edges were worn soft with age. He held them out to her, and his hand was not entirely steady. Sable took the letters. She didn't open them, not yet, because she could feel the weight of what they contained without reading a single word. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, Theron said. They're 9 years too late. They're here now, Sable replied. So am I. Something cracked open behind his eyes. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, his hand clenching at his side. The distance between them was 3 feet, maybe less, and it hummed with something electric and inevitable. Sable, he said. And her name in his mouth sounded different now, not like a memory being released, like a prayer being answered. She should have left. She should have taken the letters and walked out, and read them alone, in the safety of her room, where the distance could do its job and keep her heart intact. Instead, she stepped closer, his breath hitched. She could see his pulse in his throat, fast and visible, and his eyes were dark and intent and fixed on her face, like she was the only source of light in the room. "We shouldn't," he said. "Probably not," she agreed. Neither of them moved away. The fire crackled. The distance between them shrank to inches. Then his eyes changed. The darkness in them shifted, deepened into something wrong. His pupils dilated and the amber of his wolf flared bright, then guttered out like a candle being snuffed. His body swayed. His hand shot out and gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. "Theron," Sable reached for him. "Don't," he said, through gritted teeth, but it was too late. Her hand closed around his forearm, and the world dissolved. The study vanished. The fire, the desk, the letters in her hand, all gone, replaced by a darkness so complete it had weight, pressing against her skin, filling her lungs. Then the darkness thinned, and Sable saw where the curse took him. A banquet hall stretched before her, impossibly long, its stone walls rising into a vaulted ceiling, lost in shadow. A table ran the entire length of the room, set with hundreds of places, candelabras dripping with cold wax, and on every plate, a feast that was rotting, meat turned gray and spongy, bread crumbling to ash, fruit splitting open to reveal black cores crawling with something that moved. The smell hit her, sweet decay and dust, and the mineral tang of starvation. Figures sat at the table, dozens of them, hundreds, men, women, children, wolves in human form with hollow cheeks and empty eyes. They sat motionless, staring at the ruined food before them, their hands resting on the table, their mouths closed. They could not eat, they could not leave. They simply sat and starved in a feast meant to mock them. And at the head of the table, in a high-backed chair, carved from blackened wood, sat Theron. He was watching them. His face was carved from stone, expressionless, but his hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly the wood was cracking beneath his fingers. "Theron," Sable whispered. He didn't hear her. None of them did. A woman rose slowly from the seat nearest to him, young, with kind eyes and dust in her dark hair, and a wound across her temple that wept silently. She lifted a plate of rotting food and held it toward the king. "Feed us," she said, her voice soft and patient and terrible. Theron flinched as though he'd been struck. Sable stumbled backward and the darkness swallowed her, and she woke, gasping, on the floor of the study, with Theron's hands still gripping hers and his eyes wide and wild and full of horror. "You saw it," he said. "It was not a question." Sable couldn't stop shaking. She sat on the floor of the study, her back against the desk, her knees drawn to her chest, and tried to make her body understand that the banquet hall was gone. That the rotting food and the hollow-eyed dead and the woman with dust in her hair were not here. That the smell of decay was not real, even though she could still taste it at the back of her throat like something spoiled. Her hands wouldn't cooperate. They trembled against her shins, and when she pressed them flat against the floor, the trembling moved to her arms instead, and then her shoulders, until her whole body was vibrating with the aftershock of what she'd seen. The dead hadn't screamed. That was the worst part. They hadn't wailed or moaned or reached for her with grasping hands. They just sat there, silent, patient, waiting, as if they had all the time in the world, as if they would wait forever. And they would, she realized. That was the point. They would sit at that table until the end of everything, starving in front of food that mocked them. And Theron would sit at the head and watch, and carry the full weight of every single one of them on his shoulders. For over a year, the magnitude of it crushed the air from her lungs. Theron stood by the window, his arms crossed, his back to her. He hadn't spoken since those 3 words. and the silence between them was thick enough to choke on. How long has this been happening? Sable asked, her voice raw. Since the curse took hold. He didn't turn around. Every time I close my eyes, every time I drift for even a moment, it pulls me there. The barren feast, Sable murmured, and Theron flinched. That's what you call it? He asked. That's what it is, isn't it? A feast where no one can eat. She paused. Where you can't feed anyone, no matter how much you want to. His shoulders tightened. She'd struck something true, and they both knew it. Those people at the table, Sable continued. They're from the Grey Cairn Siege, some of them. Others are from the Blackthorn War. Others I don't even recognize. His voice dropped. The curse pulls in every death I carry, every life I failed to protect. It seats them at that table and makes me watch them starve. Sable gripped the edge of the nearest shelf to steady herself. And the woman? The one with the dust in her hair? A long silence. Vera, Theron said. The healer. She was trying to save the wounded during the siege. A wall collapsed. His voice went flat, the way it did when he was controlling something enormous. I pulled her from the rubble. She died looking at me. Sable closed her eyes. She's always the closest. Theron continued. She always asks me to feed them, and I can't. The food crumbles, the plates fill with ash, and they just sit there and starve. And I sit at the head of the table and watch, because that's what I deserve. That's the curse talking. Sable said sharply, Is it? He turned to face her, and the devastation in his expression made her stomach drop. I started a war that killed hundreds of people. Civilians. Children. The curse doesn't need to invent guilt. It has plenty to work with. Sable rose to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, but her voice was not. You went to war because a coalition of packs was slaughtering border villages. You tried to negotiate. They refused. People died because war is monstrous. Not because you are. You don't know what I did, Theron said. Then tell me. He shook his head. Theron, tell me. I gave the order to breach the outer wall, he said, and each word landed like a stone. The civilians hadn't been fully evacuated. My generals told me to wait. I overruled them because every hour we delayed, more of my soldiers were dying, so I gave the order, and the wall came down, and Vera was underneath it. The confession settled into the room like ash. Sable walked toward him. He watched her approach with the wary stillness of a man bracing for a blow. You made an impossible choice, under impossible conditions, she said, and it cost lives. And that is awful. But you are not the villain of that story, and you do not deserve to be tortured for it every night for the rest of your life. You sound very sure of that, he said quietly. I am sure. And I'm going to help you break this curse whether you want me to or not. Something shifted in his expression. The devastation didn't leave, but something else joined it, something warm and startled and afraid. How did you get there? He asked. To the feast? How did you follow me? I touched your arm. Sable said. I was pulled in. Pulled in. He repeated the words like they were poison. You were pulled into my curse, yes. No. The word came out hard and final, and he stepped back from her, putting distance between them, with the deliberate precision of a man handling something dangerous. No? This stops now, Sable frowned. What stops? This. All of it. The cooking. The meals. You being here. He ran his hand through his hair with a rough, agitated motion she'd never seen from him before. I will not drag you into that place. I will not let the curse touch you. Theron, I was only there for a moment. I'm fine. You're fine now. His voice was rising, and she could see the wolf in him pacing behind his eyes, amber flickering at the edges of the dark. But what about next time? What if you touch me while I'm dreaming, and you get pulled in and you can't get out? What if the curse decides you're useful and keeps you there? What if I wake up and you're gone, really gone, trapped in that hall with the rest of them? The last question came out ragged, and she heard the real fear beneath it. Not fear of the curse, fear of losing her. You don't know that would happen, she said. I don't know that it wouldn't. He was pacing now, and the raw fear in his movements made Sable's chest ache. I have lived in that place every night for over a year. I know what it does to a person. I know how it breaks you down, how it finds the thing you're most afraid of, and feeds it back to you until you can't tell what's real anymore. I will not let that happen to you. Let me. Sable repeated, and something in her voice made him stop. You left me once to protect me, she said, and the words were quiet and precise, and aimed directly at the heart of him. You decided what was safe for me, what I could handle, what I deserved to know, and you left, and it nearly destroyed me. Are you going to do it again? The question hit him like a physical blow. She watched him absorb it, watched the realization spread across his face, and for a moment, she thought she'd gotten through. Then his expression closed. This is different, he said. It's not. It is. Because this time you could die. He met her eyes, and the pain in them was bottomless. Go home, Sable. Go back to Brindlemore. Go back to your restaurant and your life, and forget you ever came here. I can't do that. You can. You will. And who's going to feed you? She demanded, her voice cracking. Who's going to keep you alive when I'm gone? And every bite of food turns to ash again. You'll be dead inside 6 months. Merrick said so. Theron went very still. Merrick? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sable realized her mistake a second too late. The color drained from her face. Theron. He was trying to help you. He told you. It wasn't a question. He told you everything. The curse. The starvation. The timeline. His voice was soft and lethal and utterly controlled. He went behind my back and told a civilian the most closely guarded secret in the kingdom. He told me because you were dying and you wouldn't let anyone help you. That was not his decision to make. It wasn't yours either, Sable shot back. The silence that followed was devastating. They stood across from each other in the dying firelight, two people who had spent the better part of a decade apart, and one impossible month finding their way back to each other. And the distance between them felt like an ocean. You're dismissed, Theron said. His voice was hollow. Don't do this, Sable whispered. A carriage will be arranged for you in the morning. You'll be escorted back to Brindlemore. This arrangement is over. He moved behind the desk, putting furniture between them like a barricade. His hands were flat on the surface, and she could see them trembling, and the sight of the Alpha King's hands shaking was more devastating than anything he'd said. Sable stared at him, willing him to crack, to falter, to let her in one more time. He didn't. His face was stone, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, because he couldn't look at her and still say the words he was saying. Fine, she said, her voice barely holding. Starve then. Let the curse win. Let Vira and all the others sit at that table forever, because you're too proud and too afraid to let someone help you carry it. She turned and walked out of the study. She did not run this time. She walked, steady and straight, all the way back to her room, and she closed the door, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she pressed her hands over her mouth, and she finally broke. Sable didn't leave. The carriage arrived the next morning, as promised, and she watched it from her window and didn't move. When a guard knocked on her door and told her the carriage was waiting, she said she wasn't feeling well, and could he please come back later. When he came back later, she said the same thing. By the third time, the guard had the decency to look uncomfortable. Miss, the king's orders were very clear. The king can come down here and carry me out himself, if he feels that strongly about it, Sable said, and closed the door. She expected fury. She expected guards dragging her to the carriage by force. Instead, she got silence. The carriage sat in the courtyard for 2 days. On the third morning, it left without her. But Theron did not send for her. Did not summon her. Did not come to her room or her kitchen or any of the corridors where they might have crossed paths. She was cut off entirely, excised from his life with surgical precision. The palace kitchen staff, who had been politely bewildered by her presence from the start, now regarded her with open curiosity. The guest chef who no longer cooked for the king, growing paler by the day. Because that was what happened when the bond was denied. Sable didn't understand it at first. The loss of appetite she attributed to heartbreak, the migraines she blamed on stress, the deep, grinding exhaustion that settled into her bones like winter frost was simply what happened when you didn't sleep. And she wasn't sleeping because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the barren feast, not fully. Not the way she'd seen it when she'd touched Theron's arm. These were fragments, echoes, a flash of silver plates in the dark behind her eyelids, the faint smell of rotting fruit that came and went without source. The sound of a woman's voice asking someone to feed her, patient and terrible, right at the edge of hearing. The curse was reaching for her. She could feel it, like fingers at the edge of her consciousness, testing the boundary, learning the shape of her. By the 5th day without Theron, Sable couldn't keep food down. The irony was so vicious, it almost made her laugh. A cook who couldn't eat. A woman who'd spent her life feeding others, unable to feed herself. She stood in the palace kitchen, surrounded by every ingredient she could possibly want, and felt her stomach revolt at the sight of all of it. By the 7th day, she was dizzy when she stood, and shaking when she sat, and her wolf was clawing at the inside of her chest with a desperate, keening urgency that made her want to scream. She hadn't seen Theron once in all that time, but she heard about him. The palace was an engine of gossip, and what she heard made her blood run cold. The king had collapsed during a council meeting on the 4th day. He'd been carried back to his chambers by Merrick and 2 guards. His physician had been summoned. The doors had been closed for 6 hours. On the 6th day, a servant told her in a whisper that the king had thrown a plate against the wall during dinner. Ash, the servant said, her eyes wide. The food just turned to ash in his mouth. He spat it out and threw the plate, and the look on his face. She trailed off and shuddered. On the 8th day, Merrick found her. She was sitting on the floor of her room because the bed felt wrong and the chair felt wrong, and everything felt wrong without him nearby. Her back was against the wall, and her knees were drawn up, and she was staring at nothing when the knock came. Merrick looked like he hadn't slept in days. The calm, controlled composure she'd come to associate with him was fraying at the edges, and the shadows under his eyes matched the ones she saw in her own reflection. "He's getting worse," Merrick said without preamble. "I know." "No, you don't know. Not the extent of it." The beta's voice was tight. "His body is consuming itself again. The muscle mass he'd regained in the past month is gone. His wolf is destabilizing, surging and retreating without pattern. His nightmares are worse than they've ever been, and he wakes screaming now. He didn't used to scream." Sable pressed her forehead against her knees. "He dismissed me from my post," Merrick added quietly, "for telling you about the curse. He reinstated me 20 minutes later because he realized there was no one else he trusted to do it." The beta paused. "He asked about you." Sable's head lifted. "He asked if you'd left. I told him no. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, once, and went back to staring at the wall. The ache intensified until it felt like a wound between her ribs, a hollow where something vital should have been. "Merrick," she said, "is there a healer you trust? Someone who understands bonds between wolves?" Merrick studied her. "There's a woman in the lower city, a bone setter and herbalist named Thessaly. She's old, older than she looks, and she's been studying mate bonds for decades. She's the one who first suggested that your cooking works because of what you are to him." "What I am to him," Sable repeated flatly. "His mate," Merrick said. "You know this already." She did. She'd known it since the moment she'd watched him eat her food and weep. Maybe since before that. Maybe since she was 18 years old and standing in a kitchen garden with thyme in her hair, watching a boy look at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "Take me to Thessaly," Sable said. The bone setter's shop was a cramped, aromatic space in the lower city. Thessaly herself was a compact woman with iron-gray hair cropped close to her skull and hands that moved with the unsentimental efficiency of someone who had set 10,000 broken bones. She took one look at Sable and said, "You're half dead. Sit down." "Nice to meet you too," Sable muttered, lowering herself onto a wooden stool. Thessaly circled her, sniffing the air with the open attention of a wolf reading scent. She pressed 2 fingers to Sable's wrist, then the pulse point at her throat. "Incomplete mate bond," Thessaly announced. "Severe strain from prolonged separation." Your wolf is trying to reach him and failing, and the effort is destroying your body from the inside out. Can you fix it? Sable asked. I can't fix a bond. Only the bonded pair can do that. Thessaly leveled her with a flat, appraising look. The bond wants completion. It wants proximity, contact, acceptance. The longer you two stay apart, the worse it will get for both of you. He won't see me, Sable said. Then he'll die, Thessaly replied, with the calm brutality of someone stating an obvious fact. And based on how you look right now, you'll follow him shortly after. The words hung in the cramped, herb-scented air. There's another option, Thessaly continued. You could leave, put distance between you, genuine distance, hundreds of miles. Go somewhere his scent can't reach you. In time, months, maybe a year, the bond will wither. It will hurt, badly, but you'll survive it. And him? Thessaly's expression didn't change. He won't survive it, but he's chosen his path. You don't have to die on it with him. Sable stared at the old woman and felt the choice settle over her like a weight. Exactly as Odessa would have described it. 2 doors. One led back to Brindlemore, to the stone hearth, to a life without him that would hurt every single day, but would at least be a life. The other led back to the palace, to the king who had sent her away, to a curse that was reaching for her, to a bond that demanded completion whether either of them was ready or not. She thought about Odessa's voice in her ear, the day she'd left, feed the idiot king, and come home. She thought about the letters she still hadn't read, tucked under her pillow in the palace, 11 letters written by a boy who loved her enough to leave, and too much to forget. She thought about Theron sitting at the head of that terrible table, watching the dead starve, believing he deserved to starve with them. I'm going back, Sable said. Thessaly nodded, unsurprised. Then go tonight, don't wait. Quote, every hour matters now. Merrick was waiting outside. He read the answer on her face before she spoke. How do I get into his chambers? Sable asked. The beta reached into his pocket and produced a brass key. I had this made the day after he dismissed you, Merrick said, in case you decided to be as stubborn as he is. Sable took the key. It was warm from his pocket and heavy in her palm. One more thing, Merrick said. He hasn't eaten anything in 8 days. Whatever you're going to do it fast. Sable went to the kitchen first. She worked quickly, the way she always did when the cooking mattered most, when it wasn't about technique or presentation, but about something deeper, something that came from the marrow of who she was. She baked bread. The same sourdough, Odessa's recipe. The one she'd been making since she was 9 years old. She made broth, rich and dark and simmered with rosemary and bone marrow. She sliced pears and drizzled them with honey, and arranged everything on a simple wooden tray. Then she climbed the stairs to the king's chambers, her heart hammering in her ears, the brass key clutched in her fist. She turned the key in the lock. The door opened. The room was dark except for the fading embers of a fire that no one had tended. The air smelled stale and sick and wrong. Sable stepped inside, set the tray on the table, and waited. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, heavy, uneven, the stride of a man running on nothing. The door to his dressing room opened, and Theron stood in the frame, and the sight of him stopped her heart. He was gaunt. The progress of the past month had been erased entirely, and what remained was a man being hollowed out from the inside. His cheekbones stood out like blades. His shirt hung from shoulders that had lost their breadth. His eyes, when they found hers in the dark, burned with a desperate, furious, devastating relief that he couldn't hide fast enough. Sable, he said, and her name cracked in half in his mouth. I'm not leaving, she said. I don't care what you order. I don't care what you threaten. I am not leaving you to die in that chair at the head of that table, while the dead ask you to feed them, and you sit there believing you deserve it. He stared at her. Now sit down, she said, and eat. Theron didn't move. He stood in the doorway of his dressing room and stared at her like she was something impossible, something his starving mind had conjured from desperation and memory and the ghost of her scent on his sheets. You're not real, he said. I'm very real, Sable replied. And I brought soup. A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, Not quite a sob, something broken and beautiful in between. His hand found the door frame, gripping it like it was the only thing holding him upright. "I told you to leave," he said, but there was no force behind it, no command. Just the raw, exhausted plea of a man who had been fighting himself for 8 days and had nothing left. "You did," Sable agreed. "I decided not to listen." He stared at her for another long moment. Then his eyes moved to the tray. The bread, the broth, the sliced pears glistening with honey in the firelight. She watched hunger hit him like a physical blow, watched his whole body sway toward the food with a desperation he couldn't disguise. "Sit down," she said again, gentler this time. "Please?" He crossed the room on unsteady legs and sank into the chair beside the table. His hands shook as he reached for the bread, tore off a piece, and raised it to his mouth. The sound he made when he tasted it broke her heart clean in two. He ate with the urgent, trembling focus of someone who understood exactly how close to the edge he'd been. The bread first, then the broth, in long, slow pulls, then the pears one piece at a time. Sable stood with her back to the wall and watched him eat, and felt tears sliding down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. When the tray was empty, he sat back. His breathing was uneven. His cheeks were wet. 8 days, he said, his voice rough and ruined. 8 days of ash. "I know," Sable whispered. He looked up at her. "You should have left." "I should have," she agreed, "but I'm not very good at doing what I should." "No," he said quietly. "You never were." Silence settled between them, warm and charged, and utterly different from every silence that had come before. This one wasn't filled with distance, or avoidance, or the weight of unsaid things. It was filled with gravity, the pull of two people who had spent too many years in separate orbits, finally falling back toward each other. "I read the letters," Sable said. Theron went still. "All 11 of them. The night you sent me away, I sat on my bed and read every single one." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "The third one made me cry. The 7th one made me angry. The 11th one," she paused, her throat tightening. "The 11th one said, you'd give up the throne if it meant you could come back and make me soup." "I meant it," he said. "I know you did. That's why it broke me." He stood. The chair scraped back against the stone floor, and he moved toward her with the focused, unsteady intent of a man who had made a decision and lacked the strength to second-guess it. "Sable," he said, stopping in front of her, "I have spent 9 years regretting the morning I left your bed. I have spent 14 months starving. And I have spent 8 days trying to convince myself that sending you away was the right thing to do." His hand came up to touch her face, trembling, fingers brushing her cheekbone. "I failed completely." Her breath caught. "I don't deserve you," he continued. "I left you. I lied to you. I dragged you into a curse that could kill you. But I am done being afraid, and I am done making decisions about your life without asking you first." He leaned his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered, "not because of the curse or the bond or the kingdom. Stay, because I love you. I've loved you since I was 17 years old, and you handed me a bowl of stew on the harbor and looked at me like I mattered." Sable pressed her hand against his chest, felt his heart slamming beneath her palm, wild and desperate and alive. "You've always mattered," she said. "You infuriating, stubborn, self-sacrificing man. You've always mattered, and I have loved you every single day since you left, even the days I hated you, especially those days. And if you ever try to send me away again, I swear on Odessa's sourdough recipe I will make you regret it." He kissed her. His mouth found hers with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with a decade of hunger that had nothing to do with food. His hands slid into her hair, tilting her head, and the kiss was desperate and tender and consuming all at once, and Sable felt something inside her crack open and flood. She kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands gripping his shirt, pulling him closer, kneading him near the way her lungs needed air. The bond between them surged, a warmth in her chest that demanded closeness, connection, everything. "Are you sure?" he asked against her mouth, and the question was careful and achingly sincere, despite the tremor running through his body. "I have never been more sure of anything," Sable said. What followed was overwhelming in the best way. He lifted her into his arms, and she buried her face against his neck and breathed him in. Every wall between them finally fell. The years of distance, the silence, the grief, all of it dissolved in the warmth of being held by the one person who had ever made her feel whole. When he pressed his mouth to her neck, the mating bite sealed the bond with a force that stole the breath from both of them, golden and warm and absolute, connecting them at a level deeper than anything the curse could reach. Sable marked him in return, claiming him as hers, and felt his arms tighten around her as the bond flared bright between them. They held each other afterward, his arms wrapped around her with the desperate tightness of someone who had almost lost this, and knew it. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, and the words came out like he'd been holding them behind his teeth for a decade and they were finally free. "I love you, too," she said. "Now sleep." He surrendered to it almost instantly, his body going heavy and still against hers, and Sable held him and listened to his breathing deepen, and felt a fierce, trembling joy rise in her chest. She closed her eyes and opened them in the barren feast. The hall was worse than before. The table stretched longer, the candles burned lower, and the dead were no longer silent. They murmured a rising chorus that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The rotting food had turned black, and the smell was thick and choking. Theron sat at the head of the table, his hands gripping the armrests, his eyes open but unfocused, staring at the ruined feast with the hollow acceptance of a man who had given up fighting. Sable walked toward him. The dead turned their heads to watch her pass, and their eyes were empty and patient and old. Vira rose from her seat, dust in her dark hair, the wound at her temple, the terrible, gentle patience that was worse than rage. "You cannot feed them," Vira said. "No one can." But Sable was looking at her hands. The bond, warm and golden and pulsing in her chest, had followed her into this place, and its warmth had condensed into something solid bread. A small loaf of sourdough, warm from the oven, the crust golden brown, and cracked the way it only cracked when the dough had been shaped with care. Odessa's recipe. Sable walked to the nearest figure at the table, a soldier with hollow cheeks and tired eyes who sat before a plate of blackened meat. She set the bread down in front of him. The rotting food dissolved. In its place, the bread sat, warm and real and golden. The soldier picked it up, tore off a piece, and raised it to his mouth. He chewed, he swallowed, and the emptiness in his eyes faded, replaced by something soft and almost peaceful. He exhaled, and when the breath left him, he went with it, dissolving into warmth and light and silence. Sable moved to the next seat. She didn't have more bread, but she didn't need it. The bond was flowing through her, warm and endless, and when she placed her hands on each plate of rot, it transformed. Fresh food replaced the decay, stew and bread and roasted vegetables and warm broth. The kind of food she'd built her life around. One by one, the dead ate. One by one, they dissolved into light. The hall grew quieter. Sable reached Vira last. The young healer stood motionless, watching the others disappear, with an expression that held no malice, only sorrow. "He couldn't save you," Sable said, her voice thick with tears. "He tried. He carries you with him every day, and it is the heaviest thing he has ever carried, heavier than the crown, heavier than the war. But he couldn't save you, and keeping you here in this place won't change that." Vira looked at her for a long moment. "He carried me here because he believed he owed me a debt he could never repay," Vira said. "But the debt was never his. War takes. That is what war does." She glanced at Theron, still rigid in his chair. He built it for himself. Sable knelt beside Theron. She took his hands from the armrests, uncurling his fingers one by one. "You don't live here anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "You are not the keeper of this table. You are not responsible for feeding the dead, and you are not required to starve beside them as penance. The war is over. The debt is paid, and I am asking you Please, come home with me. She pulled him to his feet. For a moment he resisted, the chair clinging to him, the curse tightening its grip. Then Sable pressed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart, and pushed the full force of the bond into him. Every meal she'd ever cooked for him. Every morning she'd watched him eat and seen the life return to his face. Every moment of care and fury and stubborn, impossible love she'd poured into feeding a man who'd been told he would never be fed again. The chair shattered. Theron stumbled forward into her arms, and behind them, the barren feast collapsed. The table crumbled, the plates dissolved, the candles went out one by one. Vira closed her eyes and smiled faintly, and the dust fell from her hair as she faded into warmth and was gone. The hall folded inward like a closing hand, and the darkness rushed in, and Sable held Theron and refused to let go. She woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm, amber light of a fire that had burned low but not gone out. Theron was awake, looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not relief, not gratitude. Peace. Quiet, stunned, unguarded peace. It's gone, he whispered. The feast, the table. They're gone. Sable touched his face. They're free. You fed them, he said, and his voice cracked on the word because he understood what she had done. She had taken the one thing the curse said was impossible and made it true. That's what I do, Sable said, crying and smiling at the same time. I feed people. He pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat in her bones, and they lay together in the quiet and breathed, and didn't let go. The curse didn't shatter all at once. Theron still woke some nights with his heart racing, and the phantom taste of ash on his tongue. The guilt didn't vanish just because the barren feast had fallen. Grief didn't work that way, and neither did healing. But the feast did not return. The dead did not come back. And slowly, night by night, the dreams grew softer, until they were just dreams, and nothing more. Sable stayed. Not as a guest chef, not as a healer, not as a secret weapon against a curse. As his mate, his partner, and eventually his queen, though the court had strong opinions about that last part. A foundling cook from a harbor town, sitting on the throne beside the Alpha King. The whispers followed her everywhere. She felt the weight of every sidelong glance, every murmured conversation that stopped when she entered a room. They'll adjust, Theron told her on their wedding night, his arms wrapped around her in the candlelit warmth of their chambers. If not, they can take it up with their king, who happens to be hopelessly in love with his wife and entirely unwilling to negotiate on the matter. Odessa came to the capital for the wedding and cried through the entire ceremony, then told Theron he'd better not break her girl's heart again, or she'd cross the continent with a cast-iron pan and make him regret it. Theron had nodded solemnly and said, "Yes, ma'am." Months later, on a quiet morning with pale light filtering through the curtains, Sable woke to find Theron still sleeping beside her. His face was peaceful, his breathing was deep and even. One arm was wrapped around her waist, and the other rested on the small swell of her belly, protective even in sleep. On the nightstand sat a plate of sourdough bread, still warm, with a pot of honey beside it. He'd gone down to the kitchen before dawn and baked it himself, badly, lopsided and slightly burned on the bottom, but he'd made it for her the way she'd made every meal for him. With love and attention, and the belief that feeding someone was the most sacred thing a person could do. Sable smiled. She settled back against his chest, closed her eyes, and let sleep pull her under. No feast of ghosts. No fog, no ash, no table of the dead, just warmth and bread, and the steady heartbeat of the man she'd loved since she was 17 years old, keeping time against her spine.